We're on to section 5 of our Coelomate Invertebrate chapter, and we're picking up with the insects, which, of course, as I've alluded to several times, is the biggest group of all animals, all inclusive. There are more insects than any other group combined, really. There are over 1 million species of just insects. And bear in mind, this is a class, this is not a phylum or a kingdom or anything like that. This is a class that has over 1 million species. So, with a group that big, it's actually fairly difficult to find a single defining trait that covers every possible insect everywhere, but we can try. So, this definition here that I have on the screen is one that I came up with a few years ago when I taught entomology. Of course, animals, right? They breathe air, got to. They have an exoskeleton, always. Three body segments, yes, although some of the more primitive forms and, of course, larval forms, they can be a bit different as well. So we're kind of getting out of the realm of all insects have this trait. But most insects have three body segments. Most insects have three pairs of legs. But again, if you start getting into larval forms, maggots and grubs and caterpillars, and they have different numbers of legs. So it's not an always defining kind of a feature for legs. From here, the rest of the traits, the wings, the antenna, the eyes, they are most of the time going to be something, but not every time going to be that something. So most of the really big groups of insects that most of us are familiar with have two pairs of wings, four wings total. Most of the insects that we're used to thinking about have a single pair of antennae, and most of the insects that we're used to thinking about have compound eyes. So for example, this mantis on this slide, it has compound eyes. It has a pair of antennae you can see. The wings, it definitely has two pairs of those. It has 6 legs. It has 3 segments. It has an exoskeleton, and it breathes air. It would actually fit all of those characteristics. But if we start getting into larval forms, if we start getting into more primitive forms like Collembola, which are springtails, you know that name, but they are going to be a bit different. Now, bugs, on the other hand, are a specific group of insects. Now, it actually is a taxonomically correct name to refer to a bug as long as it is an organism within that group. There's an order called the Hemiptera, which includes the true bugs. Unfortunately, a lot of the things that have bug in the name are not actually bugs. So if you look at things like lightning bugs and ladybugs and those kinds of things, they're not bugs. Things that are bugs are stink bugs, and those usually kind of like a triangular shape to them. Those, generally speaking, are bugs, but really to tell for sure, you got to look at the wings, and of course, that's kind of beyond the scope of this class. We're not going to get into so much the good and bad insects, but we are going to get into the taxonomy of this group. So there are 4 really, really big groups of insects, 4 orders of insects. There's actually like 30 some total orders, but we're only going to look at like 4 of them in detail. The beetles, the true flies, butterflies and moths, and ants, bees, and wasps are all in this category here. That makes up the biggest 4 orders of insects, and really the biggest 4 orders of arthropods for that matter, are in those 4 groups of beetles, true flies, butterflies and moths, and then ants, bees, and wasps. Those are our 4 biggest groups. So the orders that those fall into, these 4, are names you need to know. The order Diptera, di is 2, ptera refers to wings. These flies have 2 wings. And so if it's a housefly, if it's a mosquito, if it's anything that has 2 wings only and not 4 like most insects do, then it's a dipteran. All right, the second pair of wings is actually right back here. These are the second pair of wings that have been modified into a different kind of a structure. We're not going to worry about what those are called or what they're used for. Again, that's entomology, more detail than we need to get with this course. But dipterans have 2 wings. Coleoptera have 2 pairs of wings, but the first pair of wings is hardened into a shell, which is a protective covering that hides and protects the second pair of wings. So that's wings not really used for flight so much in the beetles, and all beetles are that way. And that is the biggest order of any animal anywhere are the beetles. There's like 750,000 species of just beetles currently named. Lepidopterans are butterflies and moths, and hymenopterans are ants, bees, wasps, hornets, those kinds of things. Those are all hymenopterans. Of course, there's a bunch of other orders. Homoptera are insects that have very similar sized wings. If you look at Orthoptera, this group used to be very, very big. It was grasshoppers, crickets, mantises, walking sticks, cockroaches, but now basically each one of those has been split out and given its own order, so it's nowhere near as big as what it used to be. Now Orthoptera is just grasshoppers and crickets. And Isoptera are termites. There's a bunch of others, but those are just a few examples. The only 4 you are responsible for principles 2 are these four. Right? I mentioned these three just kind of out of general interest, but these four are the ones you need to know for this class. All right. Now, we're going to skip this slide. It's kind of lame. It's kind of cheesy, that's all. All right, so we're going to talk about metamorphosis. Now, a metamorphosis is something that occurs in most animals that undergo indirect development, and that's going to apply to the vast majority of insects. However, it does not apply to all insects, right? So when we talk about metamorphosis and different kinds of metamorphosis, there's going to be some terminology that I'll talk about. If I say the term larva, which is singular, or larvae, which is plural, we're back to ending in an A, putting an E on the end of it makes it plural, larvae. This is the immature stage between the egg and the adult in those insects that go through complete metamorphosis. And complete metamorphosis is only one of the three models of metamorphosis, as we're going to see. If it's an insect that goes through what's called incomplete metamorphosis, the immature stage is not called a larva, it's called a nymph. So if any of you are fly fishers or know people who are, a lot of times those folks know a lot about different kinds of nymphs because they try to mimic the immature stages of things like dragonflies and mayflies, stoneflies and caddisflies, all of which go through incomplete metamorphosis and all of which have nymphs as the immature stage between the egg and the adult. And then a pupal stage, and this is again only in animals or insects that go through complete metamorphosis, is the stage between the larva and the adult. It's the stage where they transition from the immature form into the adult form, which we only see in the animals that go through complete metamorphosis. All right, so there are three models of metamorphosis. There is one called ametabolous metamorphosis, which is where basically they don't do it. They don't go through metamorphosis at all, so they're ametabolous. There is one called hemimetabolous development or incomplete metamorphosis, and this is where the insect goes through a relatively minor change during development. The immature form, the nymph, looks kind of sort of like the adult, so when they go through their metamorphosis, it's not a really dramatic change. Although a change does take place, it's not like a super dramatic change like we see in some other groups. So some of the groups I mentioned before, like the caddisflies and stoneflies and mayflies and dragonflies, all of those go through incomplete metamorphosis. They all go through this hemimetabolous development where essentially the larval and adult forms look pretty similar. The only difference is whether or not it has wings to define larva versus adult. And they're not completely the same otherwise, but they're pretty close. And then complete metamorphosis is a model where you actually have a transition from a very, very different larval form into an extremely different adult form, which is characteristic of what you think of when you think about butterflies and moths, or when you think about maggots turning into flies, or grubs turning into beetles, or caterpillars. I mentioned that already, but that's kind of more of a holometabolous development where you've got a very drastic body change from the larval stage to the adult stage. This is pretty typical. This is actually the life cycle of monarchs, which are kind of popular butterflies. You've got an egg stage, you got larval stage, which is where they go through their kind of primary feeding phase. Typically in insects that go through holometabolous, in general, the larval stage is for eating, the adult stage is for reproducing. And that's, there's a little bit of feeding that goes on over here, but that's pretty much how the breakdown works. The larvae, as they grow, go through a series of stages called instars, where they actually have to go through ecdysis before they can continue to grow. So they eat, and all of a sudden they molt and they get bigger, like all of a sudden. And they eat and eat and eat and eat some more, and all of a sudden they molt and get bigger all of a sudden. So they go through these periods of continuous eating, followed by rapid growth, followed by continuous eating during the larval stages. Eventually the caterpillar turns into a pupa. The pupa is a really important stage, very difficult stage for the insect as well, because basically the insect is completely reorganizing its body. Its wings are actually produced from its intestines. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. But eventually what comes out of the pupal case is the adult form, which then, like I said earlier, reproduces and gives rise to the next generation of eggs. So that's kind of the models of metamorphosis. Now, like I talked about earlier, when we first started covering the arthropods, whenever you have such a big group, a group that's so much bigger than any other group of group of animals, it's normal, and in fact, it's expected that you should ask, why is it? Why are they so successful? What about the insects makes them the group that is far and away, without even a close second in the distant rearview mirror, the biggest group of animals? We talked about the exoskeleton and what that does. We talked about the jointed legs and what those do. Another feature that insects kind of have that led them to become the big group that they are today is they were some of the first organisms to come onto land from the oceans, and so they simply have had a lot more time to diversify than a lot of other younger groups. They had a head start, so there are more species of them simply for that reason. They're small, so you can have a much bigger population size in any given area, and bigger populations typically means less likelihood of extinction. It also means that niches can be divided up more finely, so in any given environment you can have a lot more species of insects than you can have species of, say, large mammals or birds, just because they're small. They have a very, very rapid birth rate, short generation times. In some parts of the world, you might find insects that will have 8 or 10 generations per year, versus humans, which have one generation per minimum biologically 14 or 15 years. Not socially acceptable necessarily, but biologically possible, sure. 14 or 15 years, maybe even a little bit less for humans, but still, in that amount of time, you've had dozens of generations of insects in the amount of time it takes for a single generation of humans to run its course. So they have a lot faster generation time and reproductive rate, which also means they can evolve faster, keep up with the environment, and go extinct less frequently, which means their species number will continue to build. They fly, which is a unique thing. I mean, only the insects, the birds, the bats, and the extinct pterosaurs, big old flying dead reptiles, are the only animals to have ever evolved flight. They all did so independently, but insects do it differently than the other groups do, so that makes them, again, unique and therefore able to speciate more quickly. The holometabolous development, it's not a coincidence that the biggest groups of insects are also the ones that go through complete metamorphosis. Reason being, because the larva and the adult are so different, they feed on different things, which means you can have larger populations of both, and so therefore population size is bigger, extinction is less likely, species numbers continue to build. So we see that happening again. The larval stage and the adult stage are not competing because they're so different from each other, so therefore you can have more of both of them. We see a lot of diversity in mouth parts as well. Grasshoppers have chewing mouth parts. Mosquitoes have stylets, kind of like we talked about with nematodes, long, piercing, sharp mouth parts to withdraw blood from their host. Butterflies and moths have a coiled proboscis they can use to get down inside of flowers and feed on nectar. And houseflies, some flies in general really, but a lot of times houseflies, have what are described as being sponging mouth parts, where they will actually, when they land, if they find food, they will actually essentially regurgitate or throw up a bunch of digestive enzymes, which will break down the food outside of the fly itself, and then they use their sponging mouth parts to kind of mop up the gross slurry of food and saliva that they left behind. That's how they feed, right? So not a very pleasant image, and one of the reasons why you don't want to have a lot of housefly activity on your food. Being small has some other advantages. One of them that I don't think I have on this slide is that if you're small and you fall off of something, you're much less likely to get hurt than if you're big and fall off of something. So that's a big advantage as well, just kind of in terms of accidents and the effects of those accidents on the body. When you're small, your muscles are actually proportionally more efficient than if you're big. The reason being for that is that as an animal's body gets bigger, the power of its muscles increases as the square of the cross-sectional area of those muscles. So bigger animal, bigger muscles, stronger muscles, but the caveat here, the volume and the weight of the body goes up as the cube of the increase in body size. So even though as you get bigger, your muscles are getting more powerful, the weight that you're carrying around goes up faster as the body gets bigger. All right, so for that reason, it's advantageous for insects to be small because that makes their muscles less costly to operate, makes them more efficient, makes them more powerful compared to their body size, which means that's a very favorable thing to have. Another way to think about this, if you kind of resolve it in a different way, if you ever think about going to the gym and you see the really, really big, strong guys there, they're lifting, they're squatting 500, 600 pounds or whatever, and they're bench pressing 300 pounds and whatever. You never see those guys doing pull-ups, right? Because yes, their muscles are stronger than mine are. However, they're also a whole lot heavier, which makes it a lot harder to move that body mass. So you never see, those guys doing a whole lot of body weight exercise because their bodies are heavier than their muscles are powerful. So it makes it very difficult. And so the same thing happens here with insects in their muscles versus their body weight. Being small, like I said earlier, also means there are more niches that can be divided up among the population, which means more speciation, which means, large number of species. We talked about the short generation time, high reproductive rate, and therefore also faster adaptation of insects. And we also have the fact that they're small. It's relatively easy for them to be isolated from one another. And as we know from Principles 1, the more geographically isolated something is, the more allopatric speciation can occur and the more species you end up having. In terms of sensory receptors, there are hair-like structures that a lot of insects will use for not only tactile touch type things, but also smell and chemosensory structures in general. There are a lot of insects that go by sound, so think crickets and grasshoppers and those kinds of things. They can produce various sounds and then also receive those sounds through what's called a tympanal membrane, which is exactly what our eardrum is called as well, tympanal membrane. They actually, if you look at it, a side view of a grasshopper or cricket, right near its hind leg, the big leg that it uses to jump, there is what looks like a little eardrum, which they use to receive sounds from their environment. There are a lot of pheromones used in insects, right? So insects being very, very small, one of the disadvantages of that is that they're hard for each other to notice hard for them to notice each other is what I'm trying to say. They're small, so it's harder for them to see each other. If you imagine a female moth 300 yards through the forest and a male moth is trying to find her, right? He's not going to see her. There's no way. But if she is eliciting or putting out a pheromone that is able to stay in the air, that male moth can find the chemical, track it back to its source, find her, and they can actually mate because of the presence of those pheromones. And pheromones can be used for a lot of other things as well, not only for reproduction, but also for attacking things and for following trails and all sorts of things. Chemical ecology in the insect world is a really, really hot area of research because people are always trying to find ways to detect insects, catch insects to bring down their populations. So finding chemicals that they respond to is actually a very, like I said, popular area of research right now in the entomology world. Our next phylum here is the phylum Echinodermata. So I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and stop this section here. The echinoderms should fit pretty well into their own little video clip here. And then from there, we also have the annelids. So we're getting sort of close to the end of this chapter, but we still have a couple of pretty big groups of animals to cover. And we're going to do that here in our next sections.